Climate change is warming the Earth. That's melting sea ice. A reduction in sea ice means less polar bears. The polar bears depend on the seals that live on the sea ice. Without the seals, polar bears simply starve to death. So it's been predicted that we're going to see a large decrease in the population of polar bears. Is that really true? Are polar bear numbers declining? Climate alarmists want you to believe that they are. But what are the facts? There were two studies released in 2024 that reviewed polar bear numbers. And in this program, I'm going to have a look at both of those. But the polar bear numbers get a little confusing. So what I've decided to do in this program is to summarize everything first, and then we'll go into the detail. So I've taken the data from both of these studies and put them together into one chart. Between 1960 and 1990, there was an increase in polar bear numbers. From about 1990 on to the present day, there really hasn't been much change in the population. The one study shows a slight dip and then it comes up again, and the second study actually shows an increase in the last few years. The current estimate for polar bear numbers is between 26,000 and 32,000. And the error bars on those are pretty big. So those numbers sound like they're very different, but they're actually fairly close together. The conclusion here is pretty obvious. Polar bears are not becoming extinct. Far from it. Their population is either steady or it might even be increasing a little bit. The big increase from 1960 to 1995 was due to a change in our attitude towards polar bears. Before that time, we used to hunt them quite regularly, and that kept the populations low. In fact, the populations over time were slowly getting smaller and smaller. And in 1960 and 1970, countries became very concerned about their extinction. So they brought in some regulation that involved all of the countries that border the Arctic Ocean, and they agreed to stop hunting polar bears. That increase led to the rise in the numbers up until about 1995. How do we know how many polar bears we have? Well, it turns out that we don't actually have real good data on this. There are certain regions, like the Hudson Bay area, where Canada lives close to the polar bears and is able to monitor them a little better, so our numbers there are pretty good. But there are other regions in the Arctic where we have very little data about their numbers. Any numbers we do have is really a guess. Russia hasn't done an evaluation of their numbers in quite a long time. How do we know how many polar bears there are? Well, one way is to do aerial surveys. So we fly over the Arctic and we basically count polar bears. Now the region is so vast we can't cover all the areas, and polar bears move around, so that adds some complication. We're also able to take samples of the polar bears and analyze their genetic makeup, and that gives us some idea of how they're moving around and where they're living. In more recent times, we're using satellites to get a better picture of polar bears. And then there's indigenous knowledge. People who live in the Arctic understand the bears, and they know their habitats, they know how many they see at a particular time, and that information can be very useful. But the bottom line is that we don't have really good data on polar bear numbers. There are two reports on polar bears. The first one I'd like to look at is the State of the Polar Bears 2023. It was put together by the Global Warming Policy Group, and the author is Susan Crockford, who studied polar bears for quite a few years and in fact has written a couple books on them. Here are some of the conclusions that they reached. There were no reports from the Arctic in 2023 indicating that polar bears were being harmed due to a lack of suitable habitat, in part because the Arctic sea ice in summer has not declined since 2007. I'll discuss that in more detail later on in the program. A survey of the southern Hudson Bay polar bears in 2021 showed an astonishing 30% increase over 5 years. A concurrent survey of western Hudson Bay polar bears in 2021 showed that the numbers haven't declined since 2004. Now, historically, there are 19 subpopulations in the Arctic, but a few years ago we discovered a new subpopulation in Greenland. And so that brings the number to 20. The study concluded that The data provided to date indicates that polar bears are currently thriving and probably slowly increasing in abundance, despite an almost 50% decline in summer sea ice since 1979. When they evaluate the various populations of polar bears, they concluded that most of them are either stable or increasing in number. The second report I'd like to have a look at is the IUCN/SSC Polar Bear Specialist Group Report, and it came out in October of 2024. The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and SSC is the Species Survival Commission. They have a special group dedicated to understanding polar bear populations. If you look at that report, it goes into high detail about the various populations and the information we know about them. One thing I found odd about the report is that there's some of the numbers that haven't been updated since about 2015. That's almost 10 years ago. They've also left out the new Greenland population, and we have a pretty good idea of the numbers there, but for some reason, these aren't included either. How many polar bears are there based on this 2024 report? Well, it's not really clear. The report says the most recent estimate of global abundance is 26,000, and the range for that is somewhere between 22,000 and 31,000. But that number is based on a study containing 2015 data. When they evaluate the number of polar bears in each subpopulation, they find that several of the populations are stable, some may be declining, and several of them we just don't have enough data. What about the Hudson Bay polar bear population? This is one of the groups that is at highest risk. The ice in Hudson Bay does melt, and by middle summer there is no ice. That means the polar bears aren't able to eat. With global warming, the ice is disappearing earlier in the season, and it's taking longer to form in the fall. So the prediction is that the Hudson Bay population is going to decrease before a lot of other populations. And some of the data out there does suggest that's happening. But some recent data shows that the Hudson Bay population is actually migrating into other areas, and the number of polar bears in those areas is increasing. It seems like the increase is due to polar bear migration. Now, other scientists have pointed out that the migration of polar bears is taking place, but it's only the males that are moving, not the female. Bottom line is the scientists don't really agree on how many bears we have in the Hudson Bay area. Some feel the population is fairly stable, and others think it's declining a bit. I guess we don't really know the answer until the scientists sort that out. Now, I've mentioned sea ice a number of times, but why is that so important? The main food for polar bears are seals. And in the open ocean, bears are too slow. They can't catch the seal. So they wait until the seals go on the ice and are resting, and then the polar bears attack them, and they're able to get the seals on the ice. The ice is critical for their food source. If there's no ice, the polar bears can't catch the seal. Now, the Hudson Bay population, what they do is they're out on the ice hunting seals until the ice melts too much. And once there isn't enough ice, those bears go to land. But on land, they can't find enough food, so they have to live off their fat storage. And that happens during the summer months. Once the ice comes back and the seals return, the bears go out on the ice and they can feast again. So you can see that the seals, polar bears, and ice are very closely linked. And from a bear's perspective, it's important that the ice remains there. Less ice means less food and starving bears. Now, you've probably heard all the stories about the melting ice. I mean, the Arctic is melting so much that soon ships will be able to go through there during the summer. But those stories seem to have been a bit exaggerated. So let's have a look at what's really happening to sea ice in the Arctic. A number of you have probably seen this chart here. It shows the amount of sea ice slowly decreasing over the years. And you can see the trend line there is pretty distinct. This has given everyone the impression that sea ice is slowly disappearing. Alan Jensen had a closer look at this data, and he has a very interesting paper called Time Trend of the Arctic Sea Ice Extent Since 2007. What he did was, he took the same data that you just seen and replotted it. He changed the x-axis a little bit and turned it into bar graphs, but the data is essentially the same. Now when we look at this data, we don't see quite as clear of a trend line. In fact, what you notice is that between 1979 and 1996, you actually have a plateau where the amount of ice isn't changing. Then you have a decrease in the ice, and then you have another plateau. Between 2007 and 2023, the amount of ice is pretty steady. It's not decreasing. If we take that last period of 17 years and replot it on its own, it looks like this. And now you can very clearly see that the sea ice isn't changing. In fact, most scientists now agree that since 2007, we haven't seen a decrease in the amount of sea ice. And in fact, in the last couple years, 2024 and 2025, the amount of sea ice has actually gone up a little bit. What does all this mean? Well, it means that sea ice is not disappearing nearly as fast as people thought. That might mean that all those ships that were going to cross the Arctic are going to have to wait a little longer till the Earth gets a little warmer. It also means that since the sea ice is not disappearing, the polar bears aren't having nearly as big a problem. They're still able to get their seals. There's even some new evidence now that polar bears are able to adapt. They're finding more food on land and relying a little less on the sea ice. They're also able to migrate into other areas where the ice lasts longer. Hudson Bay is fairly far south compared to the Arctic. And so north of Hudson Bay, the ice lasts a lot longer. So if the polar bears migrate north, they will actually find more sea ice, more seals, and they'll continue to prosper. So what is the bottom line? Polar bears are not dying out anytime soon. The population is steady or maybe increasing slightly, and the sea ice is also stable. The stories from climate alarmists are simply not true. You can find Reality Time on YouTube, Substack, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. I'll put links to these and our social pages in the description below. If you're interested in gardening, check out my YouTube channel called Garden Fundamentals or my blog called Garden Myths. Let the truth shine into your life.